Ko wai koe no he koe ko wai o hapu o iwi?
Ko pai. Ko Josh te Kani ahau. He uri tēnei o Tauranga Moana. Born and bred here in Tauranga Moana, which defines my iwi as Ngāti Rangi Nui, Ngāi Te Rangi, Ngāti Pukenga. He waitaha no tēnei, e mihi atu nei. And so, yeah, I was brought up here in our flowing waters of Tauranga Moana. Did all my schooling here, and proud to be raising my family here at our papakainga at Kaitimako, just nearby to this marae. Yeah.
We are going to go way back in history now, and let's get to about the 1860s. Describe the political environment in the 1860s for Māori and Pākehā.
Yeah, well, all of our stories and the histories really, I suppose, display an environment that was actually working. We know with any political movement, there's a religious movement that sits in behind that too. And so with the coming of both the Anglican and Catholic churches here in the early 1800s to Tauranga Moana, our people flocked to the gospel, and most likely because those values sit at the epicenter too of our cultural society. And so, a lot of our tupuna had turned to the gospel as well. A lot of our ancestors, the likes of Taipari, who sits on the back wall of this whare, and his uncle as well before him, had trading schooners, and so trading was going really well. We're really great at growing vegetables and kumara and flax, and a lot of that was turning out to be profitable for our tupuna. And so we had good relationships with traders as well. A lot of our families that are still very big families here in Tauranga Moana are from those relationships with the early traders too. And so the environment was working. I think we do see a lot more pressure poured on, especially when we look towards the west, towards Waikato, and the need for more settler land, for more farming land. We did see a lot of early surveying as well around spaces too, which concerned a lot of our people. Obviously, the treaty had worked in some spaces to ease some of that pressure, but for the most part, it wasn't working. And so, there is a bit of turmoil in the background, but even so, here in Tauranga Moana, what I can speak to locally is it was pretty calm and collected. I think there might have been a bit more political dynamics really between the two church factions of Catholics and Anglicans, but all in all, it was quite peaceful here in Tauranga.
For Tauranga Moana iwi, when was the turning point?
I think the early Northern Wars were definitely a warning sign for our people. Whilst that sits a world away from us here in Tauranga Moana, a lot of our tupuna have connections and relationships with the far north, and some of those early battles and early skirmishes of the 1820s, 30s, right through to the 40s were early warnings that that kind of power and might, militant might, was tremendous, and at any point it could turn its gaze towards us as well. And so I think it seems like there was a lot of anxiety there. A lot of our tupuna returned from the north as well to share some of that news and gospel with our people here too. And I think we really see a lot of anxiety building, especially the time of Tāwhiao and obviously some of the communication that was happening between himself and Governor Gray at the time. You see a lot of angst across those many iwi that align themselves with the Kīnitanga, including us here in Tauranga Moana. And so, a lot of that gets through the grapevine pretty quick and reached all the way down the coast. And so there's a number of hui that happened with our tupuna across the space too in terms of what would happen and when that would happen. But it was a matter of when, not if, really. And so, that anxiety definitely builds, and then we see it turn into action really with the crossing of the Mangata River into the Waikato lands. to which Tawhewha had warned that would then declare war upon the Māori people. And those lines of communication were fired up across the Kingitanga network, and a lot of our tupuna heeded that call and made our way to Waikato across our traditional tracks, the Wairere, into the Haua territories and out there to places like Mere Mere. You'll find a lot of our tupuna were there at the time as well. So yeah, a lot of anxiety early on, a lot of just when it would come eventually, would kind of explode onto the scene for the Waikato, and then they would eventually transition here to Tauranga.
Did Tauranga Moana iwi embrace te tiriti?
Yes, we a number of our tupuna signed it. I think just like anywhere as well, it doesn't mean the all, the totality of our people were supportive of the treaty. It's in a similar frame as well with the Kingitanga. We do see a lot of our tupuna heed the Kingitanga call. We do see many of our tupuna who don't as well. And I think that is a part of our tupuna making the right decisions for themselves and for the betterment of their families too, as to what side they would be, most beneficial for them and theirs. We see families split down the middle. We see brothers choosing alternative sides. Hard time to be alive. Definitely.
Once Ōrākau fell and Tauranga Moana were on their way home because they were preparing themselves. Talk us through, we talked a little bit earlier about Te Papa and the preparations to build Pukehinahina, so maybe if you just start with those descriptions again, that would be great. It's quite early on actually in the Waikato skirmishes that our people received message that the manua, and that's one of our terms that we have for the British warships, had come into the Tauranga harbour. That sight must have been awe-inspiring as well. They've seen those massive sailing gunships make their way into our harbour. So the message was sent across to our tupuna who were fighting in the Waikato at the time that the British were now here. We see early descriptions of the likes of Rawiri Puhirake, who had attempted to actually stay out of the Kingitanga conflict in an effort to leave Tauranga untouched. However, as we can see, he would quickly change his tack and look to lead our people eventually at what will become Pukehinahina. But yeah, our people were in the Waikato when they received that word, and immediately, I suppose, would pay their acknowledgements to the Kingitanga, and that release of that force would now make our way back here to Tauranga Moana to prepare ourselves for what would be a front here at Tauranga. And so we see the early preparations actually for Pukehinahina that are made. Firstly, there's a number of pā that were set up prior to Pukehinahina as possible battle sites. Te Wauku is identified as one of those sites as well. And we see a lot of those tupuna of the time have huge whakapapa links to Te Wauku, which is actually in its entirety a huge space. But the place they prepared there was a previous fighting pā of old, and so it was remodelled and redesigned to, I suppose, meet the artillery that would soon come to Tauranga Moana. Preparations were made there, and in fact an invitation was also written there in both Māori and English and sent to the British, inviting them to come and fight at Wauku. The invitation wasn't taken up, and so they attempted again. They then moved their sights towards Port Teriwhi, and there was also set up as a fighting pā. It was also redesigned for purpose, for the artillery purpose, by Penetaka Tuaia, who's acknowledged as one of the founders of that pā, of Port Teriwhi, which is a transliteration of Port Relief, which was a major trading station just below on the Wairoa River for local schooners as well.
So the ridgeline above it was dubbed Po Te Riwhi as the fighting pa, and that was remodelled. Again, an invitation was written there, and also a code of conduct or rules of war, which is in itself a huge kaupapa, a huge task as well. It's a huge ask I think of our people too. If you look at our past, our heritage of fighting, the idea of taking trophies of war, etc., is very prominent. And so for our people, I think it may be another ode to the change in religion and in their Christian belief. But we would no longer do that, and it was stated clearly within those rules and regulations that no harm would come to the women and children and non-fighting men. Conditions like if the butt of the gun is turned to me, that my enemy would be taken in, and no harm would befall him. If he is to run in fear to the house of the Lord, he no harm would befall him. Mena hia kai ana, hia inu ana te hoariri ka whāngaia. If he is to ask for food or drink, that I would give it to him. And so it's a very different stance we see compared to our traditional warfare. But it's very much chivalrous and full of honour. And so we're pretty proud of those efforts too. And so that code of conduct was written out in both Māori and English and delivered alongside of another invitation to come to war at Po Te Riwhi. And again, it was turned down. And so I think about the tupuna that were in command at the time too. The likes of Rawiri, Pukehinahina and Peneti Tuaia have a common whakapapa alongside of Henare Taratoa, and in fact they're cousins in particular lines of whakapapa. And their links to other hapu, their hapu of Te Mate Rāwaho as well, sit them alongside of other hapu of the area at Te Papa, where Pukehinahina resides, of our Tamarāwaho whānau, Ngāti Tapu whānau. Very close links there, and that's actually what ties those tupuna together, who shared that responsibility of command, alongside of others like Paraone Koikoi at Pukehinahina. And so they identify a space I would think that the enemy couldn't turn down. There was a place that was deemed as safe for traders, and it's quite common throughout the rest of Aotearoa as well. Some of those bigger cities had places that were deemed safe for traders, and this place actually was demarked with a fence and a gate to allow stock to pass through from a trading space where it was safe to settle and trade in, and then really back into, I suppose, our tribal lands that were maybe a bit more restricted. And so they would go and build this pa at Pukehinahina, which was a hillock that sat just outside of that trading space, so just outside of the gate. So now I suppose it's like taking war to your doorstep from that type of perspective. And an invitation was sent out once again. Preparations were made for the pa there in quite a hurry. And so where we would usually fell trees, etc., and create this palisading, instead we had to be quite, I suppose, utilising the environment around us as well, innovative in a way, and some of the timber actually that was being stored and used for the barracks in the Te Papa space were taken overnight by night and used as in helping to create the fortifications that would stand at Pukehinahina. The Te Papa space, as I'd mentioned, when the Manuel had arrived into Tauranga, right there, Te Papa is our main trading wharf and docking area, and so that would become the home really of the military might that would unload somewhere around 1700, plus a number of other militia that would arrive, would put their numbers over 2,000 at the time, I think.
What do you think Reverend Alfred Brown would have made of the arrival of the frigates, the warships into Tauranga Moana?
I think anxiety would have set in as well, he no doubt had known that eventually the British would look to cut off the main support route for the kingitanga, which is through Tauranga Moana. So it's a blessing and it's a curse. The natural aspects of our environment here means it's a massive trading port, and it was at the time. But yeah, it would be the main support line for Waikato. And so I think the likes of Alfred would have known that it was an eventuality. And sure enough, that political power shored up here in Tauranga Moana and would unload thousands of troops and of the Navy as well into barracks at the Te Papa Peninsula. So they were taking up a lot of his space too in the mission that he had created at Te Papa upon the Te Papa block that he had also purchased too early on in the 1800s as well. And so his relationship with Tauranga Māori was really great. From what we can see is our tupuna aligned with his gospel as well, and supported his efforts too in creating a space, especially to educate our young ones as well. So they were able to come to the mission and not only learn the gospel, but learn how to read and write in both English and Māori. And so it was a blessing there. And so he would have no doubt been anxious about the relationships that were long and hard fought for here in Tauranga. He would be naturally aligned, by our Māori people with this new military might of the British. And so, yeah, he had a fine line to walk. We see him a lot of times throughout that history still really fighting for what he had advocated for here in Tauranga Moana, for that peace and to reign out. After the Pukehinahina turmoil as well, he's once again there for our tupuna. And I think overnight a lot of things would have changed for a lot of people across the Te Papa Peninsula, especially in the close surrounding areas. The people that occupy the Te Papa Peninsula traditionally align by genealogy with the close surrounding geographic areas as well. Matapihi just across the water from Te Papa. Mangata is the next major pa inland. Otumoetai is just across the water as well, which was a main fortified occupational site of our tupuna too. So, yeah, I think a lot of fear would have set in for a lot of people.
Talk us through some of the rangatira that we're going to talk about. Maybe start with Rawiri Puhiraki. Like, we don't obviously have pictures of him, but is there any descriptions, or what kind of person has he been remembered at? What was his pukenga?
A lot of the early kōrero of Rawiri Puhiraki is that he was actually quite successful in his trading efforts too. We find him in Auckland a number of times trading there, in the Coromandel area trading as well. He's actually doing pretty well for himself in that space. We see you as a very upright man and held close to his values as well. And in fact, for his own reasons, he had chosen not to support the Kiingitanga movement early on in fear that it would bring war upon his people. And so some of his networks he's able to retain over that early period of skirmishes. It's not until he's actually, I suppose he's brought up in conversation by some of his tauiwi counterparts as maybe being a traitor. And so that vote of no confidence in him actually turns Rawiri Puhiraki turns his alliances then, because they had kind of questioned his character. He actually aligned himself with the Kiingitanga fully. And I suppose that's really brought to a head too in seeing the manuao arrive here in his moana. War had indeed arrived. He didn't have to worry about it not coming. And now his alliance, his allegiances had been questioned by Pākehā. And that really, really turned Rawiri's allegiances that day. And so we see him then turn all of his skills towards stopping the insurgents of the British here in Tauranga Moana. Later on, he's noted for being a bold person, that in the heat of battle can really keep his his spirit. He was purposeful and well planned. We see that in the strategies that are employed as well across the battles. He had a plan, and he could obviously collectivise the people, because even in, I suppose, in amongst the chaos, when your nature tells you to run in fear, we see hundreds really sit in wait of the plan that was set in place, another strategy that was set in place by the likes of Rawiri Puhirake. He's noted by Hori Taiaho for, in amongst the musket fire and cannon fire, for walking taller along the parapets and ramparts. And his quote was, "Te manawarere kia au te manawarere," which can be interpreted as be still the fleeting heart, or be steadfast. And we know it to be a word of encouragement to stick to the plan. Hold fast, even with thunderous cannons, the earth shaking beneath your feet, to hold fast to the plan, and it would work. And so, I think those accounts really show the character of Rawiri Puhirake, and the fact that that many people had trust in him and in the plan that he had. I think he accounts for a lot too for the man.
And his death, he was so strategic in what he planned, but at Te Ranga, there are differing accounts, but perhaps, the colonial troops did surprise him, and they decided to mo te whenua te take, stand and fight. But what are your thoughts about his end?
I think it is a tragic end for a great character in our histories, and by all accounts a great leader, and that's taken from accounts of other great leaders. We know him to be a very well planned person, and our kōrero reinstates too that he wasn't very confident in this new place of battle at the site of Te Ranga. There are too many variables, I think, for Rawiri at the time. I think there's a number of things, though. I think their time wasn't on their side as well. Whilst it looks like it's a very different story to Pukehinahina, which happens in April, and just April, May, June, we see Te Ranga eventuate, and so it's really not very long after. And so they've already been deemed as rebels, and they're already really on the run. And you have to make a stand somewhere, and I feel like that type of pressure was maybe a part of the decision to eventually try and dig in at Te Ranga. We do see that they're early into that endeavour of digging in. We see accounts there that the trenches that had started were only at hip height. And we also have accounts as well of eventually when they're found, eventually when the British come upon them, because the accounts around that too, really good to note as well. And I suppose it does identify how I'd mentioned that families were really torn down the middle, is that you have a number of scouts too that are working with the British at the time. And when we look in the whakapapa, those scouts are very closely related as well to Rawiri Puhirake. And so because of that inside information, that may have been as to another reason as to why they had caught our tupuna before a time as they were ready to meet them in war. And so we do have accounts too that many tupuna were shot in the back because of that. So still building the ramparts and still building and digging in when they were besieged. I think it seems like such a night and day difference to Pukehinahina. One of the lines from the haka that was written in the 150th commemoration talks about ora I te pō mate I te ao. And so by the time daylight had broken, our people who had already fallen. Some of the code of conduct in our battles traditionally, they talk about fighting in the day, when you can clearly see the face of your counterpart. And so this wasn't that case, and we record that in our histories and in our haka and waiata today. So there are those counts of deception there, really. I think Māori may have expected the British to still align themselves with the code of conduct that had been written, and that wouldn't be the case here. And that shallow rua that was half dug would eventually become a mass grave for our tupuna. They talk about burying both Rawiri Puhirake and Henare Taratoa separately to the rest. I don't know. I find that maybe hard to believe, but he was later, 10 years later, he would be dug up and reinterred at Otamataha at the Mission Cemetery, which is actually, when we look at his whakapapa, it's quite a beautiful ode to the man. He would return back to his roots eventually. And at that time, the rules of engagement is found upon Rawiri Henare Taratoa. Yeah, so a sad demise for a really strong tupuna ancestor of ours here in Tauranga Moana. His close relationship with Peneti Tuaia, by whakapapa as well.
Can you talk to us about Peneti?
Yeah.
Tell us about him.
Yeah, absolutely. So Peneti was really, when we look at it and we look at his age as well, he's a well-seasoned fighting man, a war dog maybe by a different term. He'd really grown up around the early musket wars time as well. Finds himself in the north a number of times, and actually he's in the north at the time of the Kawiti battles with the British there as well. And in fact, upon return to one of the commemorations as well, we were privileged to hear some of the wānanga kōrero from our whānau, our uri of Kawiti. And it aligned perfectly too with Peneti and him being in the north earlier at the time of Kawiti's battles. And so by their account, he's there in one of the larger skirmishes too, and Kawiti's fighting flag is created at that time. And so upon that fighting flag is a representation, a symbolization of the sun, the moon and the star on a red background. Red, of course, kura, he kura te tai. It's quite a sacred colour for our people. And there were the three really the biggest symbols of the natural environment, which are again a big symbolism for our people. And they would sit upon Kawiti's fighting flag. That would fly upon the battlefield. And as the British had done here at Pukehinahina, they basically become a bullseye as your fighting flag. That has come from the British too, that you would have your fighting flag, or your flag would be posted at the epicenter of your barracks, of your fort. And so the British would shoot that flag down that day. The kōrero is that that day would Māori would suffer a defeat that day, and the flag would fall that day. Well, the very next morning, in the sky there would be the sun, the moon and the star, and that symbolism would rally the people to arms again, and Kawiti's people went on to win that day. And Peneti was there and witnessed this event, and not only him, but it echoed throughout Māoridom, especially in the north, and would make its way down here as well, that it would seem even the environment, the heavens and earth would agree with our fight and support us in our endeavour. And so these things don't fall short on our people. Peneti would take that same symbolism we see and would vest it into our flag. He would not only take that knowledge as well, that cultural knowledge, that mātauranga, but he would also bring a lot of experience in trench warfare back here to Tauranga Moana. He had seen 20 years prior up to 20 years prior in the northern expeditions. The damage the British artillery could really lay waste whole fortifications in a half a day. He knew the range, especially of the long range weapons like the musket, etc., and how to create fortifications or strategies to really give us a fighting chance. That knowledge would pay off hugely for us here at Pukehinahina. When the British really came to us at Pukehinahina, we'd be outmanned and outgunned. And so those strategies and tactics that Peneti brought with him in that experience was huge in our endeavour as well. He was the engineer of our pa. He was the engineer of all of our fighting pa here in lead up to Pukehinahina. He's attributed with the renovations that would happen at Te Wauku, again at Port Te Rewhi as well, which was a home base for him too. And then once again, he would employ that strategy for Pukehinahina, which was really a number of bunkers, and they were smaller as well. And that's, I suppose, that if artillery was to breach a certain bunker, it wouldn't be as much of an impact, and there wouldn't be as many casualties or losses. And so what he would create was really a maze of trenches, underground bunkers and concealed bunkers. Lots of corners as well. That way, musket fire, there's lots of places to conceal yourself and hide around corners, etc. Not a lot of straight spaces to be able to shoot down, and a lot of places to conceal yourself. They were dug deep, and the kōrero is once you had dug deep, you dug deeper. And I suppose that was knowing that some of the biggest guns in the world would rain terror for a number of hours, and in our case it was for over 8 hours of the day from the early morning. And so the trenches would need to be deep. And so Peneti was attributed with all of that engineering. And I think his close relationship he has with Rawiri Puhirake, we can see that it was purposeful in the strategy that one, we would be outnumbered, and two, we would be outgunned. Outgunned as far as the artillery, so the power, but also long-range shooting weapons. So Māori of the time especially, they're identified at Pukehinahina. We didn't have a lot of long-range weapons. In fact, we were armed mostly, most of the arms we had were fowling rifles and double-barreled shotguns, or our term for them is tūpara here in Tauranga. They were our number one firearm of the time. So really close range is the only effect you're going to get from them. So one, our tupuna knew that they're going to rain terror on us. We need to be well dug in to be able to outlast that rain of terror. Two, we can't pick them off from long range. Our enemy would need to be close. The closer the better. One, for our firearms that we had, but two, because Māori at the time were very, very skilled at hand-to-hand combat. Close range combat we can deal with. And that's a reoccurrence too throughout our heritage, even through to World War I. We're associated with that type of expertise, and it was no different for our people here in Tauranga. The favoured weapon for us would be the short-handled tomahawk. In a close fighting trench, it's effective. We see that later too in the record of injuries associated with the battle too. A lot of injuries to the clavicle and to the top of the head with the axe head. So the pātiti, or the short-handled tomahawk, was one of our favoured weapons. The mere paunamu again. So those short-handled clubs too would now be effective against an enemy that we had to bring close. So engineered pa, really set up to bring an enemy in, set up to really cause confusion once that enemy was in, and a strategy that would need to be employed really to endure that long-range assault to allow our enemy to come closer. And so I think we see a lot of that, really that intuition come together with both Rawiri Puhirake and Penetaka's strategy for Pukehinahina. After the battle of the siege at Te Ranga, in Rawiri Puhirake's death, we see a very angry Penetaka Tuaia. And he talks about his close relationship with Rawiri Puhirake, and because of the killing of his cousin, he would never stop fighting. So alongside of Rawiri Tata, alongside of other tupuna of the time as well, they would continue to fight even after the loss and huge defeat we suffered at Te Ranga, the loss of life we suffered at Te Ranga. They would go on to fight the fight. What always comes after the British military is the surveyors. They follow on close and behind. Generally, they survey roads going through our major pa, etc. It's happened throughout the country. Most of our major pa have a main highway, if not a main highway, a road running through them. And it's the same here in Tauranga Moana. Well, those surveyors would continue to be harassed, attacked right through the consecutive years following 1864. And so the likes of Penetaka Tuaia and others are associated with the kōrero ngā morehu o te kore tuohu. Whānau te Pirirākau wear that title with pride, and they should. Like the rest of us as well, we continue to fight on alongside of our counterparts of Waitaha, the tupuna hakaraias associated with those that would never surrender. They would always be hunted, however. Those that took part in the wars were labelled as rebels and would be hunted down eventually until their death. Penetaka Tuaia, however, he would continue to fight until the day he died, and he died of old age at one of his many pa out at Te Puna in the Pirirākau. An old fighting veteran that would continue to fight until the day he died. He stayed true to that.
And Henare Taratua, tell us about him.
Yes, Henare Taratua. He's got a really colourful history as well. Obviously, we attribute him to. He's with the writing of the code of conduct, as well as the invitations that were sent out to. And so we do know that from his history and being brought through and educated in the mission, that he is a man of the cloth as well, like many of our tupuna were of the time. His whakapapa is very much closely aligned with Rawiri Puhirake and Penetaka Tuaia, and a part of the same family tree of Ngāti Tapu, of Ngai Tamarāwaho, and of Te Mate Rāwaho, is where you'll find those three come together. And they're mainly attributed with the Te Papa Peninsula. So they have that commonality too for the actual geographic location of Pukehinahina too. So Henare Taratua, whilst he has that line as well, he's also of Ngai Taufao descent as well. You'll find factions of Te Whānau Taufao, Ngai Taufao, at Tūhua, at Mōtiti, at Ōtāwhiwhi in Bowentown, and also at Rangiwaia Island. Another faction of our whānau that are at Rangiwaia Island are Te Ngare, and to which Henare Taratua draws his loins from. And so they have close associations with the Raukawa, Te Ngare, and because of that as well, you'll find actually a lot of those Taratua uri today reside in Ngāti Raukawa territory. So those are kind of the makeup of the man, and then with that education, religious background as well, it kind of you can make sense as to why the code of conduct was written up as well, and the language that it uses is very much a parallel from the scriptures of the Bible. A very stout man to his religion and his beliefs, and. Yeah, there are stories as well. I will leave them for his uri about where Henare Taratua's body ends up after the Battle of Te Ranga. 10 years later, when Rawiri Puhirake is reinterred at the mission cemetery at Otamataha, it's said, and his stone also sits at Otamataha. However, there are other kōrero amongst whānau that, during the night as well, that his whānau took him away to a concealed place. But yeah, an amazing individual again that was able to stay true to his beliefs as well, which we admire. He may have also been another supporter of the fact that we had two spiritual belief systems operating within the pā of Pukehinahina, which I find very interesting. We had both a minister of the Christian faith and, if you'd like to call it, a minister of the Māori belief system, Pauli. Both would meet their demise, actually, at the Battle of Pukehinahina in the early hours of that battle, as they're both giving their blessings or their tohi, their rites of warfare for the toa that were gathered there. Both would suffer the same fate and die in that early cannon fire. Quite a gruesome story, actually, for one, and he was giving his blessings, and as that happened, a cannonball hit him in the stomach pelvis area, and so before your eyes, if you were being prepared for war, the person who would be giving that blessing would actually be taken away and blown apart. Into which the response we record within our haka, I nā te hinu kei roto I te pūrepo o te Pākehā, which I would describe as, look, now they're firing fats or delicacies at us out of their cannon, and I suppose that's the spray of this person meeting their demise. Whilst it's a gruesome story to tell, I think that response really reflects the courage, the absolute steadfast spirit that our people had, even amongst the chaos and the thunder of cannons, even with your spiritual guardian meeting that kind of demise in front of you, whilst he gives his blessing, you still found time and found the ability to be able to respond like that, and in a way that you would still continue to stay strong and stay steadfast to the plan. I think Henare Taratoa really provides a perspective to the chivalry that was shown after the battle. So following the Battle of Pukehinahina, where our tupuna would lie dying in the trenches and wounded in the trenches, and our enemy would lie dying upon the battlefield, we would stay true to that code of conduct that was written up by Henare, and we would go out and deliver water to those dying officers as well. Many different people are associated with that work. However, we do see it as the work of our wahine. And so I suppose it is providing that balance and that narrative too, that our wahine had their part to play as well in the action that took part that day. I think it's a reflection too of the grace as well that we would show each other, and the courage to do so in the midst that kind of fear upon the battlefield is huge. Really wanted to note that kind of that honour that was shown to as well to our enemy upon the battlefield. We have tupuna that were noted as bellowing out into the night on a part of the battlefield for asking for a match for his pipe. I think we'll remember those stories as much as we remember the war, the way our tupuna conducted themselves. We also remember the grace that they showed as well for each other. Yeah.
Did he get the match?
Apparently he did. Apparently he got the match to light his pipe.
Is this the last requests vision?
I feel like it would be, yeah. I feel like, if you were dying on the battlefield and you just wanted to smoke your pipe and you couldn't get to a match, or you were unable to move to one, But yeah, you'd call out for a match in the night. And it was during that night as well that because when that military strike did happen, it was the afternoon, and by the time that would have cleared, it would have been the late afternoon heading into the early evening, and so darkness would have befallen upon the pa as well and upon that battlefield. So you would have had those injured lying there overnight. The injuries they sustained too, when you have a look through those records, because the hospital and where it's situated now is actually where the tent hospital was set up at the time of Pukehinahina. That's why the hospital was there. So it's always carried that purpose as well. But you can read through that manifest too of the injuries that our tupuna sustained, those that died there as well. And it's not just getting shot and rolling over and that's me. It's, numerous musket ball wounds, bayonet wounds, and after the 7th shot, they're lying now asking for a match for their pipe. It's pretty unbelievable, the courage and the perseverance, I think, that was shown from both British and Māori upon that day. Inspiring in every way.
Is Tauranga, do you reflect on that code of conduct and perhaps the first, I don't know if it's the first book of the rule of war or whatever, but is that something that you feel pride about in terms of how your tupuna kind of kicked that off?
Absolutely. I think at a time where the easiest thing to do is draw a line in the sand and define your enemy as your enemy and let anything before them. I think it just shows a real endeavour to hold fast to our core principles, even amongst that. When we come upon our marae today, and I've been through many wānanga for our local marae, and we're trying to define our tikanga. What's our tikanga? And at the climax of one of our wānanga, it just came to a point and just said, well, our tikanga here is manaaki tangata, no matter what. And I see that not only the writing of that code of conduct, but the ability to stick to it. It's just a tremendous belief in those core values that make us who we are, and their actioning of it. I think at that time, we have just fought against this man face to face in the trench, and now here he is, and he needs water. For you to go out there and give it to him, I think is it's inspiring. It's the courage to do so, but that steadfast spirit, I think, is not just to the battle and to the strategy, but it's also to our beliefs. And I think it just showed that our tupuna believed that at the core, people were people and they should be taken care of, even my enemy. Yes, it's something I'm extremely proud of. Yeah, I think all Tauranga people should be too. It might not have been the first code of conduct, but I feel like it was one of the first code of conduct for battle that's been written by an Indigenous people and delivered to the British of the time. Rules for fighting and the art of war had been discussed previously in our histories, but from an Indigenous people to write that rule of regulation for the fight and how we would conduct ourselves in an honourable way, written in both the native language and in English to be given over, I think is a moment in history here we should be super proud of. Yeah.
Was the expectation that the code of conduct would continue to Te Ranga and that the British would respect that?
Our kōrero here is there was an expectation that the rules into how we would meet each other on the battlefield would continue after Pukehinahina. We had stuck to that rules of that code of conduct, and I suppose we hadn't deviated from it, and so in no way had we felt that our enemy should and would. And so there was every expectation that we would carry ourselves in an honourable way moving forward from Pukehinahina. We record a lot of that in our histories, and you can hear the spite. You can feel maybe the dissatisfaction that had never happened, because it certainly didn't happen at Te Ranga. In fact, I still toss with the idea of calling it a battle, because it was so one-sided, but it's recorded in our histories that way. But some the stories that we record about Te Ranga are not a prepared front for both. They're not two sides coming to meet each other in the day with the knowledge that there was a laid-out battlefield, that we were clearly identified how we would conduct this battle. That wouldn't happen that day. We'd be met before the sunrise. We at the time we talk about a lot of our families still being present. They hadn't yet been sent away. I think that gives you a clear indication too that we were in no space to be ready. A lot of our whānaus we had now come back to, that we had left earlier. So for instance, for the Battle of Pukehinahina at this marae right here, a lot of our families were left here to watch the battle and listen to it across the water. And so our fighting men went and took part in that battle. At Te Ranga, it wasn't just our fighting men that were present with us there. We still had our women and children and our elderly with us. There's a lot of stories too about just how they were set upon and then pursued as well as they looked to escape. And they would plunge over some of the ravines down below and still not escape that fate, and they would be shot as they cross streams. And I think that part of it we still hold a lot of spite for, and you hear it in our kōrero. When our people talk about Te Ranga upon the marae, in our own settings, we never talk about it like it was an honourable battle. Yeah, and that's all I've got to go on. But I suppose the histories as well and how they're recorded too, just really show a one-sided battle. So that does really line up too with how things may have been met on the day.
What were the consequences of the war on the people of Tauranga?
Yeah, post Te Ranga is, it's a huge sad period for our people. So I suppose the rebellion in its most part, in its strength, had really been quelled. Our people relocate. Tauranga Moana, Tauranga Tangata is our kōrero. We're people with a close affinity to the sea. Our traditional domains all encompass a faction of the coastline and of the harbour, and then it stretches up into the hinterlands. And each kind of tribal hapu have that kind of environment from the sea back into the mountains. We would no longer be able to access the sea, and so because the soldiers would be stationed down at Te Papa, which is the harbour and the harbour entrance, our people relocated. It was too hostile for them in these areas. Rebels were being hunted out. So if we understand that, and I think sometimes even today we're all tainted with the same brush in different places. I feel like that would have been the same thing for our tupuna. So rather than endure that kind of hostility for being branded as maybe a rebel, being questioned in different circumstances, being harassed, they would leave these areas with our tamariki and our elderly, and we would move to, because we're transitional people, and so we have other kāinga that sit up in the hinterlands of our domain. We would relocate to those places, and they're really only seasonal places, and so a lot of them weren't really appropriate for that current climate and for that season as well. But we would go and settle there and back into those spaces where we felt we were far enough away from the hostilities that came with the soldiers. because there's a natural animosity there that carried on from those soldiers too. We see it in the actions that are recorded in our stories as well. And so those that were branded as rebels, their names, they were named and identified, and they were pursued into those spaces. People like Penetaka Tuwaia, people like Hakaraya, another of our tupuna of Waitaha, who eventually would just be hunted to his demise in the end. They would be pursued. So everywhere they were, had an account of them being, they would go to those places. And these places were just villages. Some of them weren't even villages. They were literally just a few kainga set up as seasonal hunting spaces or farming spaces or gardening spaces. And I suppose in that time as well, so we're suffering just a lot of sadness at the loss of a lot of our great leaders of the time. We're now relocating out of our traditional domain into other spaces. We're still trying to make a way for ourselves as well. And at that time too, the Scorched Earth campaign would kind of kick off. And so the Scorched Earth policy was employed, and slash and burn is basically what that reflects. And so they would come into those seasonal occupational areas and forcibly remove our people from them. And that's probably a really PG way of putting that. Our accounts are tragic. We have accounts of young babies being flung into the air and landing on bayonets, and we have accounts of elderly women who weren't fast enough to vacate areas being beaten to death, and we have accounts of just real travesties happening within the kainga with our women upon these areas, and so some real mamai. It's a really hurtful time for our people, and we haven't really, as a people, had a chance to really review that time and find even reconciliation really with it ourselves. It's actually, for a lot of our great-grandparents, for myself, they just wouldn't talk about it. There was a time they just wouldn't talk about it. They'd talk about histories beforehand and afterwards, but they just would stay clear of anything associated after Te Ranga. I think a part of the hurt there too is that, a lot of our extended whānau were employed at that time to do a lot of that hunting out of our other tupuna. They were brought in and used to force our people off some of these spaces. And so it's a very dark time in our histories here in Tauranga Moana. And we really, I suppose we really haven't recovered in a lot of ways too from some of that, some of those traditional domains where we were forced from, when some of those uri eventually would return, other uri were there. So even those kind of outcomes kind of happened as well, where people would lose that kind of that environment that we're traditionally associated with that, and with that is also our reo. Our language is something that is born from the earth too, and from our particular unique environment. Our description of that is held in our language too, and so that recovery in language and in knowledge of self and of identity, coupled with just the loss of life, I think, at the time was a real, it's still a very hurting point for our people today. That would carry on actually right through to the late 1860s. In fact, around the 1868, we can kind of see that quell a little. But then you have people like Penetaka who just held that attitude towards his enemy until the very end, and he would die later, very much later on, from old age. We definitely need to provide our own spaces as well to talk through some of that hurt. Not to hold anybody to account, not to make anybody feel guilty, but I think just to be able to talk through that type of mamae may allow us the space to somehow recover. Sharing in those spaces, I think, is always a good thing. So, yeah, it's definitely something our current generation would love to provide, those types of opportunities for our people to do so.
It wasn't Crown-led, so this was something separate, and that was probably on purpose, eh?
Yeah, yes, definitely. It seems to me like, when we kind of line up the other historical events that had happened prior to the New Zealand Land Wars even, we can see some real purposeful movements by neighbouring tribes. We can see some real purposeful movements as well by people that aligned themselves essentially with the government of the time too. It's without a doubt. Some of the parcels of land would end up in hands they should have never ended up in, and that's just a clear indication of the purposeful intent of some of that strategizing really that had happened post-war.
Sorry, what I meant is, I believe it was Gilbert Mayer who led that group, and it's a militia, eh?
It really is.
So can you? So once the Crown had gone to, once we had colonial troops at Pukehinahina and then again at Te Ranga, this next one, which your iwi is now calling Te Ranga, was not colonial troops. It was something quite different. Can you explain to us who it was and who they were employed by and what the purpose of that was?
Yeah, well, a lot of that militia that were caught in were dubbed the Te Arawa Flying Column. When you look into the histories there's some of the biggest and baddest names really of the Te Arawa Confederation. It's not a unnatural counterpart to our local tribes here in Tauranga Moana. In fact, in our traditions, Te Arawa are one of our most traditional enemies really across our histories, especially with the Ngaitarangi Confederation. And so the enemy of my enemy is my friend is definitely the tactic that was played here. We see a similar, in a similar instance, our Te Arawa whānau, and I say that too, especially sitting in a whare that is very much a Te Arawa aligned whare here in Tauranga Moana. They're employed as well by the British too, even the day before Kei Pā. And so we see the stance that's taken at Pukehinahina was to be supported by the rest of the Mātātua Confederation and including Te Tairāwhiti. So toa as far as Taua, as well as far as Te Tairāwhiti, as far as Ngāti Porou, Te Whānau Āpanui, Te Whakatohea, Ngāti Awa, Tūhoi had gathered and had made their way down the east coast towards Tauranga Moana. However, with the knowledge that the Manuao had now come into our harbour, it was restricted access. They wouldn't be able to just make their way as per usual into our safe waters. It was cut off. They would come ashore at near the current Matata township and progress on foot along the Matata Straits, or what would be now the Matata Straits. And they would be met there by a huge force of Ngāti Pikiao on the ground and other allied who were deemed kupapa of the time, Te Arawa, who there together with militia again and supported from the water by the British gunships of the time, the SMS, Sandflyer. I think the Sandflyer was one of those gunships as well that would bombard that cohort. It was up to 1,000 fighting men too that had made their way down on that journey as well to support us here at Pukehinahina, who would be cut off by that same militia too. And so those same networks were employed as well by Gilbert Mayer And of course, this is the younger Gilbert Mair. And post Te Ranga, so post the land wars here, they would be employed as well. They didn't do it for nothing though. They actually asked for a pay rise, from what I can see in the histories. Their usual rate for those services wasn't going to be enough. And we hear from the likes of Koro Des Tata that they'd actually asked for a pay rise in their efforts to come over here and continue to hunt down the rebels, those that were deemed rebels of Tauranga Moana. However, their food rations wouldn't be taken care of. And that's some of the understanding that we have as to why Te Ranga was such a treacherous time. The way that they would feed themselves is from the food stocks they would look to destroy at each of those villages. And they were huge food stocks. There were acres and acres of potatoes. We're very good at growing kai here in Tauranga. Our soils are rich with kahakaharoa ash, which makes for some of the most fertile soils in the district. And yeah, our people were very accustomed to that. And so that's how they would feed themselves. They would basically raid these villages. They would be given a certain amount of time for them to replenish their stocks and their food stocks and do whatever else they wanted to. And then the force would come in and move those people off and burn everything left behind. Whare, fields of crops, would all be decimated in the process. It is a very purposeful tactic. We're only just going through some of the healing, really, for that, the restoration of those connections that we have with our family of Te Arawa. Just recently, actually, in some of our commemorative efforts, we've seen the unification again of Te Arawa and Tauranga Moana. And we're very proud of that. There's a vast history there, yes, of conflict, but a huge history as well of acknowledgement of mana. And that's something today that we're trying to recover. And so, yeah, with that though, there is still a lot of hurt and a lot of mamai. But yeah, it's something we have to tend to now. Maybe our tupuna weren't in the right position and in the right time to be able to do that in their instance. But we feel like we're well equipped, one, with the understanding of those histories, and two, with the knowledge as well of our connection to our Te Arawa whānau. And so, yeah, hopefully we'll see a lot of the healing happen over the next few years.
What are you hearing, from their perspective of their position at the time? Can't imagine it was easy for anyone who was having to deal with the Crown. Absolutely.
I have been fortunate to engage in a few conversations with some very well-versed and knowledgeable people of Te Arawa as well. And I do often have that conversation with our own here in Tauranga Moana too, because I myself am a corresponding uri of the whakapapa of Rawiri Pukehinahina, but also of the whakapapa of the likes of Hohepa Hukutaia, who are associated as well with some of the rebellious movements of scouting on behalf of the British, etc. And so often we've had to grapple with those same conversations ourselves. But in my conversations and discussions with some of my friends of Te Arawa, we see tupuna make the right decision, what they felt was the right decision for them and their families. We have no understanding of the context of the pressure they were put under to make those decisions. They very well could have been tupuna that purposefully knew exactly what they were doing and would know the benefit of that. But as in the same instance as well, we have a number of tupuna that had no choice. They would either die whilst they stood there, or they would look to raise arms against a traditional enemy. So, I think that's really the context of it, is that we don't understand in full. We never will. No amount of history is written or whakapapa handed down from mouth to ear will give you a clear enough context as to exactly what they were facing at the time they made the decisions they did. Yeah, we do see the reasonings, and they can be seen in our histories. But yeah, I'm not willing to make that type of judgment over our tupuna.
What do you think's been the consequence of war on the people of Tauranga?
I think amongst the suffering of land loss, I think with the suffering of loss of identity, loss of language, which are huge things. You know, identity is what ties ourselves to people in place. An individual with no knowledge of who he is or who they are, kind of doomed to roam the earth disconnected. And so it's a real sad fate for a lot of our whānau that we're always trying to reconnect with. But I feel like some of our biggest suffering may be our disunity. Yeah. I think I'm a part of a generation too who see so much power in unity here in Tauranga Moana. We're a very special breed. You know, we have a number of waka. Tauranga te tauranga o ngā waka is the saying for Tauranga, the safe anchorage of many waka. You know, we've got a beautiful Te Arawa origin story. We've got a beautiful Tākitimu origin story. We've got this dramatic entrance of the Mātātua story. We even have stories of Tainui anchoring and moving, and you know, we're people that are made up of a mixing pot of great mana. And it seems our tupuna knew that as well, because they employed that at Pukehinahina. They drew upon that as a strength at Pukehinahina. And we've never seen a stronger tauranga front than the front that was united against a common threat to our existence and to our sovereignty and to our self-determination than at Pukehinahina. And it's something that I think really inspires, especially my generation, and we feel that we can still attain that great power. We can still tap into it, into that unity. It's only found in unity here in Tauranga. A few times we've been given glimpses of it, you know, in some of our cross claims efforts, where the call has gone out again, the pū have sounded, and we've come together and collectivised ourselves for common purpose, and we see a great tauranga again. But in between time as well, and I have seen our grandparents and our parents suffer that disconnect with the many tribes they call Tauranga Moana home. There's some of that needs to come in the healing conversations that we've talked to. But yeah, it's something that I feel that our people had a great grasp on in lead up to Pukehinahina, and confiscation, and then eventually our attempt to settle through the treaty settlement process has really torn us apart again. Whilst the intention has been for settlement, which should be self-explanatory, to be able to settle into our space and settle the grievances of the past and settle our path forward. A lot of destruction and disparity has come with settlement, the settlement process, I should say, as well. So yeah, I look at that as being one of probably our greatest sufferings of the land wars. But it's nothing that we can't recover from. Yeah.
Reflecting on the past, what's your message for the next generation?
I think we tell them all of it, you know. I think we tell them both. I think we tell them kia au te mana warere. I think we tell them, to have that undying fighting spirit for what they believe in. I think we tell them to be steadfast in the midst of adversity. And I think we tell them to be unified in their approach. I think there's these narratives that come from our histories that whilst they're very unique in their timing and in their context, that they all have a very special part to play in serving purpose for the next generation. Now more than ever, we have to have all of those attributes that we can find along that time period. I also believe that, we don't ignore the mamae as well. I think that's something we tell the next generation too. I would like to be able to set that example rather than tell them to try and find that place of reconciliation. I'd rather we action it and they learn from our action than trying to really strengthen them to do something that really we could have done, that we should have done in our time. But yeah, I think that's something as well that I would hope that our next generation take upon themselves too, is to never turn away or ignore that mamae, but to acknowledge it and address it. That'll be my that'll be something I'd happy to fight for our next generation.
Kia ora. We've talked a lot in the series of interviews about the characters of the fighting groups, and one that we didn't talk about today was Hori Tupai's men, and often people call them like the old veterans of the war and things like that. And it's really cool in this story to hear the difference across Pukehinahina, and obviously Te Ranga's different because they didn't get to fight. But we've just been talking about the Te Arawa flying column, and I guess, can you explain a little bit more about why they were, were they good? Were they good at fighting? Who were they? How were they selected?
Yeah, I think it is good to hark back to that saying, that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and in this case it was very well known who our historic enemies were. These layers and layers of histories of conflict, more so between the Ngai Te Rangi and the Te Arawa Confederation. And I suppose that does really hark back even to the inception of Ngai Te Rangi itself. So Te Rangi Hauhiri himself, who the iwi derived their name from, is killed at the hands of Te Arawa in the early skirmishes for Maketu. And this is still Ngai Te Rangi yet to make an entrance into Tauranga. So very early in the period, we can even look at the whakapapa and place that around the late 1500s, 1600s time. And so Rangi Hauhiri is to meet his demise at the hands of Te Arawa. And so from that time on, really, there is great conflict between those two tribal confederations, really. At the same time as well, Te Arawa through Waitaha have a very, very close relationship with Ngāti Ranginui. So in the first instance, the settling of Tauranga Moana is with Ngāti Ranginui and Waitaha iwi. So there's already close affiliations there, but very much conflict with this newcomer to Tauranga Moana. And so our history of conflict with Te Arawa is very well known, right through to the 1800s. So the Battle of Te Tumu, I think, happens around 1832, around that period. And the Battle of Te Tumu is really the climax of a number of skirmishes back and forth between the Ngai Te Rangi and Te Arawa confederations again, in the similar fashion around the Maketu area. But it's really a race, an arms race, that drives those battles forward. And so the scene is set, really, for a long time between two quite bitter enemies. Peace is made at that time, following the Te Tumu conflict. It falls away at times and comes back and is reiterated by chiefs like Hori Tupaia, who continue to find efforts and ways to make peace again with the Te Arawa. But obviously we see the British arrival into the area as well, earlier conversations with the Confederation of Te Arawa, see the majority of our Te Arawa Confederates align themselves with the Queen, with the British. And it's pretty evident too, even amongst the in the context of Kaukauroa and lead up to the Battle of Gay Pa. And so once again, in following on from Pukehinahina, which was really the British against Māori of Tauranga, and then again at Te Ranga, we see really the British against Māori of Tauranga. But later on in the skirmishes which follow in what we've dubbed Te Weranga, which are skirmishes that happen into the bush line of our domain, into some of those Paengaroa, Oropi area, right out to the Te Puna area at Whakamārama. We see the employment of the Te Arawa Flying Column. And they were dubbed the Te Arawa Flying Column really from that campaign. And so they're employed by Gilbert Mayer at the time, who has a huge history with us and with the knowledge of this relationship, both good and bad, between Aotearangi and Te Arawa. It's something that his forefather, the elder Gilbert Mayer, had actually become accustomed to in his early time here in the early 1800s as well. So that he was very well knowledgeable of the dynamics at play here in this relationship between tribes. And so, yeah, we find Gilbert Mayer organising the Te Arawa Flying Column. We can see from the individuals that make up that faction as well that they're some of the best fighters of the time period. Some of them have been well versed in war and had indeed taken part in the earlier wars with Ngāi Tarangi before the British. And so now they would be employed there, and literally employed, so they'll be paid for their services as well to come in and basically hunt down the individuals that were now branded rebels after the fall at Te Ranga. And so a price was put on their head, and wherever they would go or wherever they were associated at being, those places would be left to rubble, and worse. And so we see a lot of animosity as well from that time period, is reflected in the turmoil that ensues across the Te Weranga campaign, the Bush campaign, which it was known as earlier. We see them as coming in. Now, they were brought in really because this wasn't an open battlefield anymore. It was more around guerrilla warfare, a type of situation. So you needed, British just weren't accustomed to our terrain and our territories as well and our environments. And so you would go and hire people that very much were. And Te Arawa knew our terrain. They knew how our people would move as well, as they move in a very similar fashion. Even their attire, actually, so the use of the woolen blanket at the time was employed by the Te Arawa Flying Column, and that was actually adopted too by some of the British soldiers that would become a part of that Te Arawa Flying Column as well. And so they just knew the insights as well, I suppose, to that type of warfare that we'd become accustomed to over the time of the Bush campaign or Te Weranga. So they knew how to hunt our people down. They had a sense of the territory and where these locations were, and so they knew how to get to our people, and they could do that very effectively. Not to mention there's that historic animosity as well, which we see really enacted in some of the actions that they carried out at some of these places.